to Resiliency Within. I'm your host, Elaine Miller Karras, and today's show is entitled The Diverse Experience of Asian Americans, Hate Crimes to Healing. My guests today, Reena Patel and Kimberly Wong, have worked throughout their careers in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. They both are members of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of the Trauma Resource Institute. Sparked by the recent shootings in Georgia, this show will look at hate crimes in the Asian American community and honor the diversity of lived experiences within the vast group labeled as Asian American. Reena Patel and Kimberly Wong will be speaking from their respective lens as Indian American and Chinese American individuals whose experiences both overlap and greatly differ in response to events in the last several years, and most recently with the uprise in violent crimes toward Asian Americans. They will explore how the concept of othering creates fear and ultimately endangers individuals and communities who are not considered to be part of the widely accepted American narrative. In addition, they will explore ways to move from othering to us as we look to ways to bring healing to our communities. There are two organizations right now that are compiling data about the increase in hateful crimes and incidents towards Asian Americans. They are the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University and Stop Asian American Pacific Islander Hate. The center released findings in early March demonstrating hate crimes against Asian Americans spiked 149% between 2019 and 2020. The Stop AAPI Hate kept track of nearly 3,800 hateful incidents during the first year of the pandemic, and most of them were targeted towards women. But on March 26th, there was a National Day of Action of Healing, and the hashtag Stop Asian Hate trended across the country. Led by Asian Americans, thousands of Americans gathered from Washington, D.C. to California to show their solidarity with Asian Americans. It is my honor to introduce our audience to two powerful voices in the Asian American community. Let me tell you a little bit more about Kimberly and Reena. More detailed bios for both of them are on the website, resiliencywithin.com. I'm going to start with Kimberly. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She received her MSW from UCLA. She has a private practice specializing in trauma with extensive experience working with survivors of sexual and domestic violence. She is committed to community social work, and she's worked with a number of organizations, and this is just a small smattering. There's more. Peace Over Violence, the LA Gay and Lesbian Center, the Asian American Drug Abuse Program, and she's a member of the LA County Domestic Violence Council LGBT Issues Committee. And she's also, I'm proud to say, a certified trauma resiliency model practitioner and facilitator. Now, Reena is also a licensed clinical social worker, and she earned her MSW from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India, as a Rotary Foundation Ambassador Scholar. She received the NASW Emerging Social Work Leader of the Year for Arizona's Chapter Branch 2 in 2018. Ms. Patel has worked with the Trauma Resource Institute since 2016, and she most recently traveled to India with me, actually, and she was a part of the launching of the Sea Learning program that was inspired by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And she currently is the clinical manager at Old Pueblo Community Services, a housing first and harm reduction organization. Welcome, Kimberly and Reena. And as we get started, is there anything on your mind that you want to begin with? And I'm going to start with Kimberly.
Well, I think that what's really been on my mind this past week is George Floyd and the trial against Chauvin, the police officer who killed him. And I think that, and I bring this up because as we're focusing on the experiences of Asian Americans and the hate crimes against AAPIs, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this exists in the broader context of racism and oppression against many different people, other people of color, the Black, Brown community, as well as just other groups. And that I'm glad you mentioned that because I do think it's important to stand in solidarity and speak up and out against all forms of oppression, regardless of whether or not you identify with the group. and it's really been on my mind. I couldn't not do this without acknowledging, the losses and the current trial
Thank you,
for
Kimberly,
George Floyd.
for bringing that in. I know I've been watching it myself, and one of the things that also struck me was the incredible empathy of the people who witnessed the horror of his murder. And with all the hatred that we see, that's also been something that's touched me deeply. To see how much compassion, how many people called 911 and said there's something terrible happening. But thank you for bringing that into our discussion today. So now, Reena,
Sure.
anything on your mind as we're starting our time together?
Yes, thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Kimberly. Kimberly, you said those words about George Floyd, and I concur, and I'm with you in terms of really paying homage to all of the lives that have been lost in terms of hate in this country and what that looks like. And something that's been on my mind that I also want to just say up front is that even what we're talking about today, that in this moment for Asian Americans, that I do want to make sure I give space to you, Kimberly, being Chinese American, the folks that are really being attacked right now and in the past year in response to what's happened with COVID and the anti-Asian sentiment are people that look more like you than people that look like me as a South Asian woman. And so, I want to acknowledge that and create space, because I know that the experience that's happening for you right now may be different than what's happening for me. And that's just really important. It's on my mind as we move forward in this conversation.
Thank you, Reena. Thank you for that. So I'm going to ask both of you a question. And during these challenging times, as we get started, is there anything that's helping you get through right now? I'll start with Kimberly again. Is anything helping you get through?
I mean, I think being here is one of those things. I forgot to thank you. I am honored and to be asked as a guest to be on your show to talk about these important issues. And I'm also excited to be doing this with Reena. And part of what's getting me through is working with people who have similar beliefs and who are working towards fighting against oppression. And so part of what gets me through is working in the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee of TRI. And that TRI felt this was really important to do and started this committee probably about 5 years ago.
Yes.
Maybe 4. I'm not exactly
I think
sure
you were at the
long.
first meeting. Yeah, so the TRI is the Trauma Resource Institute. So thank you for that. And I think that I just want you both to know that as long as I'm doing the show, you'll always have a voice here. And so, Reena, what about you? Is there anything in particular that's helping you get through right now?
I'm looking at Kimberly right now, and I think, the work that we've been doing on this committee and the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee with Trauma Resource Institute, it has been such a sacred space, I would say, for those of us that are engaged in this work. That, it seems like every other week there's something else now that we're having to grapple with and work on and figure out and process, and to have a space to come to every week has been invaluable, honestly. And now having this shared, this collective and shared joy around just being able to be with one another as well, and being there for one another. Like, I would consider now Kimberly a sister, in a lot of ways. And, and it's because of this work that now we're being able to be together. So that's been very helpful.
So we can't say enough about the importance of relationship and how we build relationships that bring us together in common goals and as humans, as humanity. I had on my show last week Joy Miller, who did her work on the Holocaust, and for some reason I want to share this again. And I said, well, and she actually investigated how women got through being in Auschwitz and the different camps, and it was because of love and relationship. And so when I see the two of you have now become sisters and see the love that exists between the two of you, I think that's why I wanted to bring that forward too, because I think maybe that's also part of what we need more of in the country when we talk about these very serious issues. And so I want to segue now to the reflections on the recent shooting in Atlanta, Georgia. And I know it's been difficult as a Asian American women, and when we see the statistics are directed, much of the violence is directed towards women. I think there were 5 Korean Americans that were killed in Georgia. So Kimberly, would you like to start and let us know about your reflections about this?
Yes. So I think that I'm glad you were talking about how a lot of targets have been women, and I do want to say that, like, in this hate crime or racialized violence, the targets were Asian women, and this really brings together the intersections of identities, of ethnicity and gender, that I think are really important to acknowledge. Asian women have often been viewed as submissive, exotic, and they've often been fetishized and sexualized. And these kind of elements, I think, in some ways came up in this. Um, it was it's a hate crime in that it really affects not only obviously the people who were murdered and killed, but because it was targeting Asian women, it and the Asian community, that it brings on a certain fear and community trauma, even, and can feel very personal. And even though it didn't happen to, like, for example, it didn't happen to me. And some of the interesting things about this that came up is the man who shot the women. He went to 3 different massage businesses that were Asian run, and he said that he admitted to police later that he had a sex addiction, and that he wanted to essentially get rid of the sex addiction, and was blaming this community or blaming these businesses for that. And so that is something that's really upsetting, and it is essentially blaming the survivors. The other piece I think is really was very upsetting was when the sheriff talked about it, because the sheriff brought that up. This is how we know that the shooter had said he had a sex addiction, is that he basically, the sheriff said that the shooter had a really bad day, and that he very much humanized the shooter. Not that, of course, he's human, but so were the victims. But the emphasis was on the shooter having a bad day and having a sex addiction, really minimizing the violence and minimizing the racialized violence that went along with that.
So as you say that out loud, I mean, there's the horror of what happened, and then there's an additional aggression that can happen in terms of the way the officer responded. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight, because I think sometimes people don't realize that, oh, well, he was this or he was that, but what he did was against the Asian American community, and in particularly women. Yes.
Right, Asian women. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention as part of the stereotypes, or how Asian women are perceived, is again being sexualized, regardless of like, I think that he was coming, the perception, his perception, not the reality necessarily, is that there were in some ways sex workers. They may not identify in that way, but that's the perception that also is very much tied to that.
Right.
As well.
Yeah. And that's kind of in the broader macro system way that is something that's perpetuated. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Reena, and what is your reaction? Do you have anything to add to what Kimberly has already stated?
Kimberly, thank you. I think the points you bring forward are, things that have been on my mind as well, and specifically with Asian women and what that looks like. And something I just want to add is that when, looking at the media coverage of what's happened as well was really striking to me, and it really goes to this piece of othering, this blanket ethnic gloss term of what Asian American really is. And I couldn't even find what ethnic group these women belong to for several are. I mean, I really had to really dig to understand who are we, where's this violence being targeted? Who who are these individuals? And my heart, it goes out to their families and their loved ones, and to not even recognize, like really understand the entirety of what was going on in this community and what community we were even talking about. And so that was really striking to me. Again, the bigger piece of how Asian Americans are understood, I think, in the United States, and what that even looks like and what that means. That we weren't even able to articulate what specific community this was within the Asian American community. Yeah.
So as you say that, Reena, it's like, it's in terms of like being valued as part of America, would be to acknowledge that what you're saying, and that was another aggression.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that kind of segues into our next question, and is, how are Asian Americans scapegoated when Americans feel threatened by outside forces? So Kimberly, do you want to start with that?
Well, I mean, in some ways, what's happened since when you talked about Stop AAPI Hate, that organization came together on March 19th, 2020, in regards, because of the increasing violence that was already starting to occur against people of Asian descent or who appeared Asian. And so I think in some ways, like, Asian Americans, right, have been scapegoated on COVID, regardless
Absolutely.
of, I mean, that's what's happening. I think you said it was 149% increase.
Yes.
And it's now being talked about. And obviously the shooting was a horrific thing that occurred recently, but the reality is the increases of hate crimes towards, or Asians being targeted, has started way back in March, which is why they started the organization. And I remember just personally feeling a little uncomfortable. I was starting just as walking in the world, starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable, and just and there was some fear attached to it.
So I think that's another important thing. And, in our show, we often talk about neuroscience and how the fear response operationalizes in all of us. So as we watch something like that happening on the news, and even though, as you said earlier, it didn't happen to me personally, but it did happen to us, because we as human beings, there's something called mirror neurons, and mirror neurons that we see the suffering of others and we internalize that. And when it's something like a hate crime, then we can start feeling a bit more hypervigilant and fearful, even though it hasn't happened to us. And I think it's an important thing if we have Asian Americans that are listening, or people of color going, why am I so nervous? Why do I have this hypersensitivity? Because we're designed for survival. That's the way we were created. And so that fear response, there's a part of the brain called the amygdala that starts to fire and saying, oh, guess what, Kimberly, you're in danger right now. It doesn't necessarily make sense, because maybe it's the neighborhood that you've always lived in and you felt safe enough. But now it's saying, well, how do I know that? If it could talk, right? But it's a biological process, and it's about keeping you safe. So anyone that's listening, really important that you understand that hypervigilance may be more amplified right now because of what's happening. So I'm going to go to Reena next and say if you see what you would like to respond to that question as well. Is how are Asian Americans scapegoated? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. I want to speak a little bit to historically how Asian Americans have been scapegoated in our country. If we think about, even long before World War II, but if we take World War II as an example and what happened to Japanese Americans, right? We had someone coming off our shores, and there was a threat perceived to the American ideal or to American soil. And so in that moment, Japanese Americans were very much targeted and scapegoated. At 9/11, and I can speak to that personally. In Mesa, Arizona, Balbir Singh Sodhi was one of the first men that were shot in the series of hate crimes after 9/11 towards Arabs, Sikhs, and Muslims. And he actually was down the street from where we lived in Mesa, Arizona. He owned a gas station, and he was planting a garden actually when the folks came in and they shot him and killed him. And he had just donated to the victims of 9/11, actually, September 15th. So it was just a few days after. And I remember that really clearly. And I remember what you're talking about, Elaine, with the amygdala and what happened to my body. At that time I was I was in high school, but we had a small business, and my dad put an American flag outside of our business for the first time. And I remember watching him and thinking, Dad, why are you doing this? And he said, well, I need them to know that we're not one of the people that they need to be hurting. And I remember being really struck by that. And as again, with the brain and the body, my family was hyper vigilant for quite some time, going to the same grocery stores and neighborhoods that we would typically go to. It just did not seem the same. And I do think at that moment, Asian Americans that looked like me happened to be scapegoated, right? People that appeared Arab or Muslim or Sikh. And in this moment now, we're seeing, our Asian American siblings that look Chinese American or East Asian, right, are being scapegoated at this moment. And so to me, when I think about that question of scapegoating, I really think about the concept of otherness, right? We usually scapegoat communities that are not ours, that are other or different than us.
And so that kind of your response is actually kind of segue to the next question. You've partially answered it, but I think I want to ask it just to see if there's more that you want to say, is how do these events, hate crimes, impact not only individuals, but communities, and how they interact with the narrative being American? And I think you just stated some of that, Reena, but there may be more, Kimberly, that you want to say about that.
I mean, I think again, I don't have, you said that so beautifully, Reena, so thank you for that. I think again that it does feel, when it's a crime against a community, a hate crime, that someone's targeted because of their perceived group, it does instill certain fears, as you mentioned, like in the nervous system. There's also grief and sadness, and it's also as if sometimes it's that we experience these things personally. And so I think that just becomes important. I can't tell you the number. I'm a therapist, and the number of clients that I see, and I see a range of people, a lot of people of color, but not all. And the Asian clients that I've seen have been upset in a way that's so much different than the other clients I've seen. So I think that that's important. And some of the, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but some things that have come up is like this sense of not belonging. And I know we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, about being American, but that we are not often seen as American. We're seen as Chinese, or we're seen as foreigners, no matter how long we've been in this country. And I do want to say one.
Go ahead.
Can I?
Yes,
just one other thing, which is that, while we may be immigrants, I also think it's really important that most of us are immigrants. Unless you're an Indigenous person, Native American person, we all are immigrants in this country.
Yeah, and I was, as I was hearing you both speak, I was thinking about Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, and German Americans were not. Right. So that you see the distinction between people of color and and people who are seen again as being othered, and how the treatment is different. And I think that, I always thought when what happened with the Japanese Americans, and here I'm a person who definitely has had advantage being a white person, thinking, oh, that would never happen again. But I have to say that with the things that have been happening in the last few years, that's a little bit of a shaken belief now. And I think it's something where those of us that work with trying to bring people together have to really be stalwart in saying, how can we create these dialogues of giving people voice so that these things don't happen again? When we come back from our break, I want to talk a little bit more about how do we acknowledge and hold meaningful space for diverse voices within the group labeled Asian Americans as well. So we'll come back and maybe talk a little bit more about that. I know that you have a lot more to say, and I'm hoping that when we come back from the break as well, that maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the resources that you've developed to share with our audience, because I think just even about if you're a spectator, how to respond. I know I've been in situations like that where I've felt really a lot of anger, and also always wondering, well, if I say something, will they target me as well? How do I say it in a way that would be the most productive to have a voice, to make a stand, because I fear silence. And I think that if we are silent about these things right now, that we're just going to perpetuate. And that's why you both having voices and your communities having voices, to me personally, are so important, is how do we change these dialogues. So with that, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, our guests, Kimberly Wong and Reena Patel, will continue their discussion about the very important experiences of Asian Americans right now. And we'll talk a little bit about healing and what do we need to do. Or I'm really interested in your perspectives of how do we create the us and get rid of otherness, if that's possible. Wouldn't that be nice? Thank you so much. And we'll be back in just a moment.
All clear. Just a moment while we save the first segment.
Okay, let me know when we can start. It's so different when we're not live.
Oh, is it?
It is, because it's like you have 2 minutes. You guys are doing great, by the way.
This is really going fast. It's 1:30.
I told you it would go fast. Yes. Let's see. We have a lot more questions, but it's all right. We'll get through as many as we can.
I mean, these questions were just ideas. I thought that might be helpful for you to see where we're going. So they're overlapping.
But I love the questions, and I love this next one, because I think this is a really important one. How do we acknowledge and hold meaningful space?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we create that? But you guys,
did you want to go first on that one, Reena?
Sure. Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
I can, that's okay with me. Yeah, we could do that, because I wanted to say something more about social exclusion and the brain. And so I could start with that.
That would, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. No, I told you it would go fast. I was just especially with the two of you. Oh my goodness, I could interview for 3 hours.
All right, ladies, we are ready if you are.
Thank you very much.
All right, here we go. Second segment in 4, 3, 2.
I'm Elaine Miller-Karish, your host, and I'm here with Kimberly Wong and Reena Patel, and we are going to continue our very meaningful discussion about the violence that has been directed towards Asian Americans, and most importantly, how can we start some dialogue that changes some of the vitriol and the hatred that we've seen. So the question is, how do we acknowledge and hold meaningful space for the diverse voices within this group labeled Asian Americans? So how do we do that? So Reena, do you want to start with first?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Elaine. In the work that we do with the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee, some of the research I came across around social exclusion and the impact on our brain has been really fascinating to me. Our amygdala, as you were talking about earlier, perceives social exclusion as a threat, which makes sense, right? If we really are meant to live tribally and communally, right? That if we're excluded from our group, that we would perceive that as threatening, and our cortisol would rise, and we would have that same stress response. And so I think about that a lot with the Asian American community, because if we are walking in this experience of otherness, of feeling different or feeling excluded, as Kimberly had talked about, this perpetual foreigner feeling, then that social exclusion can constantly be something that we're experiencing. And so I wanted to just put that out there, because, for my Asian American folks that are listening, that, sometimes you may be feeling a heightened stress response when you walk into a room. You might be wondering where that's coming from. Well, some of those pieces are real, because we're constantly being told that we're not part of this country, or we're not part of this narrative. And I think holding that meaningful space and saying, yes, we are, my relationship to this land, to this country, is going to be different than my Native American brother or sister, or my African American brother or sister, but I do have a relationship to this land, and I value very much being here and what I have to contribute to the people around me. And I think having those spaces, I think I wish that somebody would have talked to me about that when I was younger, and it started to unravel those myths around what it meant to be Asian, and this model minority myth, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. I think having more spaces where we give Asian Americans voices. So Elaine, what you're doing today on your show, it feels huge to me, actually, just to be able to talk about the fact that Kimberly and I are from two different communities. And yes, we do have overlapping experiences, but we also have very different lived experiences. But Americans probably see us lumped in one category. And so it's just, walking with that in our identity is just it's so important to give that voice. I would love to see more Asian American stories, narratives, opportunities like this. Really educating yourself about the different communities that do exist in the United States that are considered Asian American. And there's so many different languages, cultures, beliefs, economic status. I mean, it's vast. And so holding that meaningful space, I think we could start doing that even in our schools and what that looks like. But yeah, those are just some of my initial thoughts is, I really just think even being able to hear narratives from different lived experiences in the Asian American community can be so powerful.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the truth and value of truthful history, because the histories that we often learn in school don't include the histories of people that you're saying have been othered, right? Or they're marginalized even in our books, and how we learn about how we're. I can remember when I was a kid, we were called a melting pot, which to me seems anything but that. But that's what was broadly taught to my generation of children. So how do we change those histories, and how do we get that, like you said, if you wish you would have learned as a child? Because I think that part of the dialogue, in my perspective, is the voice of children, and how do we bring children into this conversation? But I want to give Kimberly an opportunity to respond to that question as well. So Kimberly, do you have anything to add to what Reena has said?
I think creating space, again, like you invited us both to be on this show, and you created space, and to acknowledge that there are different lived experiences. Because all too often with many groups, there are various like stereotypes or ideas, and then it becomes a single dimension of who you can be. And we have, there's so much richness and diversity amongst everyone, and within the Asian American community. I think something else, I think being open, having discussion, listening, because a lot of times people are told like who they are, the story of who you are as a person. And something I wanted to also acknowledge, and I'm just going to do a short note, because this is some things that you can do. And again, as being perpetually a foreigner, no matter how long you've been here, is that we're often not seen as American. And, I'm third generation, meaning my grandparents immigrated. My parents were born in LA. I was born in LA. But like my, people who are of European descent typically aren't asked questions like, where are you from? Or things like that. And a lot of what's happening is, that I'm hearing a lot, is people of Asian descent, Asian Americans, have the sense of not belonging. So creating space that you belong. And there's some very like small little things that can be done that are like really well-meaning people don't realize they are contributing to this sense of feeling like I don't belong. And for example, I just hopefully very briefly, I was talking to a friend a few years ago, a longtime friend, and I was probably talking about she's a white American, and talking a little bit about my experience being Chinese. And she said, well, it must be so hard to not be American. And right. Now she is a compassionate person. She's a compassionate person, caring, well-meaning, not trying to be harmful. But I'm saying this because, and I'm just hoping that listeners out there can be thinking about the fact that the words matter. That I'm from here. I've never been to China. My parents didn't go to China until they were adults because they were, both born here. And so it's just small, subtle things that we might not think about. And granted, these are things that are ingrained from a long time ago. And so to actively question what you're doing, I think becomes important, and kind of going back to how do you hold space.
Right. In terms of just making that comment again, an empathic person, but said, oh, it must be hard not to be American. You're reminding me of something that's a little bit, my mother, you both may know, immigrated from El Salvador, and she had a very, very thick accent. And I've just never thought about this before, but people would always say to her, where are you from? And she would respond in a very feisty, fiery way that as a little kid used to embarrass me. But she'd say, I am American. And she was very proud of being an American. And that was a choice that she made to come to this country, which, when people come to this country from other places, there's reasons why they came. And I think for her, it was a personal affront to her when they would just hear her accent and then make a determination. So I think you're talking about the same thing, and no wonder she had that reaction. And I think that's something for us all to think of, maybe as other ways to if we do hear someone who does have an accent, not to make an assumption about what that means. So, and I want to just say, Reena, I know we've had this conversation. You want to say anything more about this? I mean, but this is really dynamic.
Sorry. Go ahead, Elaine.
I said, or we'll go to the next question.
Well, I have a similar experience to Kimberly. Again, we both look very different, but it's, as you said, Elaine, we have people in our families, or in my family, with accents, people who look differently. And it really brings to life this question of who is American and what does American look like? And I would love speaking of children, I would love for kids to be able to explore it and unpack and celebrate what that is from a younger age. Like, what does it really mean to be American or look American, right? It's just.
Well, maybe that will happen someday. Maybe it's already happening. And I mean, I think that we both love the C Learning program, and I think they're trying to generate ideas of compassion and ethics and how children look at that. And I think part of this is part of the discussion. But we've been using the word othering, and I know that some people don't know what that means. I know we've alluded to it, but I think it might be worth a little discussion about what does it. Othering is, we see it a lot now in the literature. We see it in our conversations, those of us that are in the psychotherapeutic areas, social science. So can you give us a definition of what othering means?
Kimberly, I can speak a little bit to just some thoughts on
Please.
that. So othering, I don't have a formal definition in front of me, but when I think about othering in this context, it's practices, principles, systems, laws that exclude a group of people purposefully or intentionally. So I think the intentional part is really important here, because it's one thing to other when you don't really know or you don't mean to, right? That's one form. But when you're othering intentionally, now we're looking at forms of oppression. We're looking at systemic racism. We're looking at structural powers, right? That want to exclude other groups. And so I put the word intentional in there because othering in this context, I feel like, is intentional, right? So when we talk about the response in World War II to Japanese Americans versus German Americans, when we talk about what's happening with people during this time of COVID and where that anger and that hate is being directed towards, I think it's a very intentional othering. So, Kimberly,
Kimberly, yes.
Just to kind of go with policy stuff, many people have heard of like one of the first immigration laws that targeted a community, and it's the 1982 Chinese Exclusion Act. Did I say 1982?
It was 1882.
I mean 1882.
Yes.
Which was was a targeted group excluding Chinese laborers. But what I found out very recently, as we've been having more of these discussions, is that there was an earlier immigration law that was targeting single Chinese women in 1875 called the Page Act. I had not heard of it, and it was kind of interesting because I think that there are some parallels to what happened with the shooting in the sense of an Asian women being targeted. And they were targeted because they were viewed, if they were single immigrating to America, that there was this perception that they were sex workers or going to be sex workers. And so they were excluded for that reason. And what I was reading is that some of the public perception was, going back to scapegoating, is that the Chinese women specifically, who were sex workers, were spreading sexually transmitted infections, unlike their white counterparts. So they were viewed as spreading STIs. And so that's why there was this Immigration Act. And so I was thinking about how interesting about that kind of scapegoating, and then some of the
And
perpetuation of some of the ideas of Asian women.
Right. And I think what I've also was reading, preparing for the show, there's been cases where a Chinese American child was not allowed to go to a certain event because of the fear that a Chinese descended person might be spreading the virus to the rest of the children. So I think it's important to know that these things are happening today. Not only did they happen in 1875 and 1882. And so, how is that little person who was excluded because of really words that were coming out of politicians in calling something as, I don't even want to say the words because I don't want to promulgate that here, about the virus. So I think we really need to be cognizant of that, of how we speak. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
Go ahead, Kimberly, please.
Just one thing that I also think is really, really important in thinking about the othering to us is that historically, quite often, groups that have been oppressed have been pitted against each other. And so that creates divisiveness. And so kind of, I started, and when you asked me what's on my mind, and one of the things I talked about is, and you yourself, Elaine, mentioned, is standing in solidarity.
Yes.
And I do think that it becomes so important to have solidarity. And Reena, you also mentioned just standing with our brothers, sisters, and non-binary sibs, who come from different groups, who are different religions, who are different ethnicities, races, sexual orientation, genders. And that's part of bringing, going to us and being able to acknowledge and honor and respect our different lived experiences, to be open and listen, kind of thinking about holding that space, because we're all part of this larger community trying to fight, oppressive forces.
And that brings me to another question, and that is, can you talk about your own lived experiences as part of the diversity within Asian Americans? And are there aspects that are unique to the experiences of being Asian in America? And I know you wanted to talk about the model minority myth as well. So Reena, would you like to go first with this one?
Sure, I can, and I want to speak to something that Kimberly said. This is something that I know we've been working really hard on in the equity, diversity, and inclusion work that we've been doing. Is I want to take this moment and space to also acknowledge the anti-Blackness that's even in my community as South Asians. Being able to acknowledge that these things exist within our communities of color, that we are placed differently on this spectrum of racial trauma and this violence and this hate. And I want to acknowledge that I also have privilege in this aspect as well, that my experience is not going to be the same as as a Black woman, or somebody who's not cisgender and who identifies Native, and so I want to be able to acknowledge that space, because I think that's a lot of the work that we're doing. Is if we're going to move towards us, we need to also recognize where we are, do a lot of healing work around that as well.
Reena, can I ask you just for clarification? Because
absolutely,
our listeners may not know what cisgender means. Can you just give a brief definition?
So cisgender is when your gender matches, I guess, your sexual orientation. And so your sexual identity and your gender match. So if you identify as male, and then you also if your gender is male and your sexual identity is also male, so that would be cisgender. So for me, I identify as a cisgender woman, and I identify as female. And so thank you, Elaine, for that,
Yes.
for that pause. And so I want to acknowledge that in the work that we're doing, and and that is part of, I think, how I know my experience as a South Asian woman, to your question, Elaine, is that I didn't understand that there was so much divisiveness within communities of color, that I was socialized to have certain feelings around maybe the Hispanic population or the Black population. I didn't know that those were things that existed even within my community until I was older, and I realized that there was so much divisiveness even within our own communities, and that was really eye-opening to me, and has really been helpful for me in this journey on equity and diversity and inclusion and what that looks like.
And so, Kimberly, would you like to add to what Reena's talking about right now?
Well, thank you. I agree, and thanks so much for sharing about that, because I do think that is a lot of the work that we're doing, and this is what gives me hope, is that we want to invite people to be able to look within themselves and to look at the ways and things that they were raised with, and to challenge some beliefs, that beliefs or behaviors or language that may be contributing to a person's own internal biases, because we all have it, and that's okay. I think what's not okay is not doing something about it, and not challenging it.
And this is where the dialogue, I think, comes in, that you've been talking about all along.
Yes.
About how we come together. We may look differently, but if we can start having the dialogue, even talking about, well, as someone, your parents came from India, right? And so you were born here. My mother came from El Salvador. I was born here. I'm not sure how many generations back your family came, but we all of our families came from someplace else, right? And if we come together and we start discovering, some of the histories, and I imagine that some of them too might have some commonalities too in the experience of first coming. And I know my mom didn't speak English when she first came to this country, and she had to learn it. And there was a woman named Elaine who was a waitress at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco that taught her how to speak English. And guess what my name is? Little stories that come through, right? As we have these lived experiences.
And one of the things,
go ahead.
I think you had asked, about our diversity, or our the question was a little bit about how there might be diversity within ourselves.
Yes.
I think it was something like that. So I just kind of wanted to go on with that, which is, which makes some of the diversity is illustrated in just like our immigration, and like from where we're like the fact that Reena's parents, I think, were immigrants, and with my grandparents that are immigrants. And what that means is we have different experiences as Americans, because like Reena probably, I won't speak for Reena, but maybe Reena can speak to it. But I know that quite often people who are born with parents who are immigrants are having to straddle cultures, a lot of, because there's more connection and ties with the ethnic culture or from the place, because the parents are bringing that over. And so I think that that's a difference that comes up, or as part of diversity, and is the generation.
And then, Reena, do you want to add to that as well? I think there's differences in the generations, and being born here or coming here as an immigrant.
Yes, I think, thank you, Kimberly, for mentioning that, because when folks are, those of you that are listening, are working with Asian Americans in whatever capacity, or have colleagues or friends, or really trying to create space of belonging, generational factors are a big piece of understanding Asian American communities, right? Where you land on that generation spectrum can really make a difference with your experience, and what that looks like. And like, as Kimberly was saying, straddling those both cultures, and what that ultimately means for that individual. Elaine, I do want to, I don't know if we have time to talk about that model minority myth.
Yeah, please go ahead. We do have a little bit of time. Yes.
So I just want to, because I think a lot of for your listeners, I think it would be important for them to know that that term actually came about in the 60s, in 1966, in a New York Times article. And really what that term was referring to, the model minority, are Japanese Americans that were successful despite the discrimination they were being faced with. And I think it's super interesting because if we think about what was happening in our country during that time, during the civil rights movement, it was essentially a way to say, don't be like those people of color over there that are using their voices to get what they need and get their right and get their human rights met and to make sure they're living in equity, but be like these people of color over here that are being quiet and putting their head down and working hard. So I encourage you all to look up this article, this New York Times article from 1966. I believe the sociologist was William Peterson. And, I just encourage you to educate yourself about what this model minority myth is, because really it's not something to be proud of. Honestly, it's something that we should really be speaking up against and to use our voices as Asian Americans and say, no, this is not true. We have varied experiences in our community and we refuse to be quiet. We want to make sure that people in this community also are getting their needs met and that we belong.
I love what you're saying, that we belong. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to give Kimberly, is there any parting word that you would like to say, to add to what Reena just said?
I don't think I have anything to add, except the one thing in regards to that is, I think that was like, again, a way to pit groups against each other.
And what I've heard from the two of you today is, how do we come together and not pit groups against each other? I'm hoping that each one of you can tell me one resource that would be important for maybe our listeners to be able to learn from. We just have a couple minutes left. So Reena, I'll start with you. What is one resource that might be helpful?
So for those of you that are in California, the South Asian Network is a great organization that works with South Asian individuals, LGBTQ plus individuals in the South Asian community, also mental health services that are very culturally specific and linguistically specific. And so I just encourage you to check out their website, southasiannetwork.org, and to familiarize yourself with those services.
And then Kimberly, can you share one with us?
Yeah, I mentioned Stop AAPI Hate. I think it's really an important one. And while it's a place for reporting hate crimes, if you go into the menu, there's a bunch of resources, and it talks about what to do if you're a bystander. There's links to other organizations that they're collaborating with on bystander trainings. So this is, again, about how do we come together.
Thank you.
And stand up for one another.
And what is the website again? Can you say it one more time?
StopAAPIHate.org. So
okay.
STOP.
Okay. And I just want to thank both of you for being on the show and for your thoughts and for your voices. And as we close today, I want to remind our listeners, how can you be a part of changing the dialogue of discrimination in your community? Maybe it starts in your household. Maybe it's at your job. Maybe it's at your synagogue or your church, or whatever community that you belong to where you gather. And remember the power of one, and what else can be true. Each one of you are one person. And here we hear Kimberly and Reena sharing their voices with us. And I imagine you could have a voice to share as well. So thank you for joining us with Resiliency Within. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Reena.
And we're clear. Great show today.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for helping us.
All right, Elaine, did you have any questions for us since this was your first pre-record?
No, but thank you so much for teaching me about pre-recording for the first time.
Yeah, we're happy to help. We have this set aside in case guests can't make it during a certain time. Then we have that backup option.
Well, that's exactly what happened today. So thank you so much.
Our pleasure. You have a fantastic weekend.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. You guys did great. Oh my God.
Thank you, Reena.
Thank you, Kimberly.
I love how you speak and everything. Like, I don't know. It's just really
you brought up some beautiful points. That was really fun, Elaine. You can have us back anytime.
Oh, believe me, I will have you back again. Well, I've had 14 shows now, so basically, I've had I had Kevin, I had Kevin and Mike on. That turns out to be one of the more popular shows.
I listened to it
yes,
like over the weekend.
I had Phil Allen, who talked about his film. I had Reena Everett, who, that was during Black History Month. I mean, I've had some, we're rocking it. We're getting it out there, right? So I'm going to we have a wonderful intern this year. Her name is Rangina Salim Ehsan, if I'm saying her. But anyway, she just gave the most amazing webinar. We had a meeting where she did our presentation about being a Muslim woman, and really important things she's going to UCLA getting her MSW, and she's actually had colleagues say, well, I would never ask someone about their religion in therapy. And she's going, well, that wouldn't be something that would be helpful for me. I mean, it was so interesting just to see the perspective. I was actually talking to her this morning. So she's going to do a webinar for TRI, and she's going to do one of our Crim Global calls, but I'm going to have her on the show too. So I'm really hoping that I can give voice. But the other thing that struck me, you guys, I never thought about my mom and about how she would get so angry when people asked her where she was from, especially after she became a United States citizen. I mean, she always felt, she didn't get her citizenship for a long time because she was afraid of tests and she thought she'd flunk. I mean, she of course passed the first time she took it, but I just, I was feeling kind of sad because it used to annoy me because she'd get so angry at people, but I didn't realize that.
Well, but Elaine, if you think about that whole social exclusion piece, every time someone asks us where we're from, it's like, you're not in my tribe. You're not part of this country. So it almost feels like a trauma response, right? It's like, wait a minute, no, I am. I'm, like I belong here.
I'm from America.
Yeah. So much of the hate crimes and stuff. Like there was one in New York that just happened, I don't know, a few days ago, where a man, it was an African-American man who pushed an older Asian woman down.
I saw it. It was horrible.
So this is why I wanted to bring up the pitying thing.
Horrible.
But was saying things go back to your country. And like for a lot of people, it's like, well, this is my country. It's confusing.
Yeah.
I'm in my country. I was never, at some other country.
Unfortunately, I heard that so much stuff from Trump. Who he's another person I don't like to talk about. He shall not be named.
Well, and he really, as we know, I know he who shall not be named, was, really put fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
He was horrible.
With his,
he's still so many groups.
Kung flu and all that stuff, and blaming the China virus.
What he said about Mexicans the day that he started his campaign. I mean, it's just been, but you know what? We're doing something so positive, and we're doing something that's helpful, and we're not acknowledging the suffering. We're acknowledging the suffering, and we're saying, how do we come together? That's what I love about the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you so much for
It's really and it's been healing and reparative, I think, in a lot of ways for, I think those of us that grow up in these cultural identities that don't feel like we have a voice, and then being able to be an adult and do something like this, it can really speak to some of those pieces that we're missing, that needed to happen. So thank you.
Well, and it's going to be a podcast. It's going to be a podcast too. And what happens is that I'm learning about this Voice America is that most people listen to it later. So it will be live on 1:00 on Monday, but people listen to these podcasts. Oh my gosh. So, I mean, every month so far, my numbers are going higher and higher, which is a really good thing. Right. So I think I'm like, I'm on the lower end because, I just started, but I'm something like the top 15% of podcasts in the country, but on the lower end. There's people that are millions. I'm just thousands, right? So, that's going to be good. We're going to continue to try to make it. So, and that's why send it to everybody, send it to Tata. The more people we get to listen, then our voices are being heard. And even if you
I was confused. Are we supposed to send it via email, like those emails?
You can send it anywhere. You can send it
by email. I posted it on my Facebook.
Yeah, and the thing about it is, I've actually complained to them about my big old face on everything. They're going to be changing it but it's like they have a template that I have to use
Okay.
for the e-card, and that's why my face is so prominent. Oh my God, it makes me sick. But anyway, but they're apparently are in the process of changing it so the guests will be prominent and then I will be below. But I just want you to know I didn't create that template. That came from, Resiliency Within. It's a little bit too much.
It would
for
be
me.
good. It would be good. Obviously, you have a lovely face, and we want your face
Yes.
out there. And I was thinking, like on social media, if it had our faces and it was our contacts, and people might more likely listen.
Right,
to it.
exactly. I think you're right. But
Because they might see who's this lady.
but I think it's on the e-card though. Doesn't the e-card have your faces on it or doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Oh,
Yeah,
it does. Yeah.
So I just know mine's more prominent, but just tell your friends. Well, Elaine apologizes.
But when it goes on Facebook, it's you.
Yes, I'm so sorry about that. But
Which-
anyway,
It's okay.
that's the template
It's
from Voice America. So, but if you can send it to as many people that you know, then that gets people listening, and then that's going to broaden our voices in terms of the kinds of shows I'm having.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Do you know if it went on Facebook today, or did it not do that?
no, I didn't do.
And is it accessible?
So what? In fact, I should
okay.
stop it right now. I didn't put it on Facebook. What I just did is I just made a Zoom thing.
I'll record.